The board has voted, Mr. Caldwell. Your heritage fence is a violation of Covenant 7.4, subsection B, regarding unapproved construction materials. You have 30 days to remove it, or we will have it removed and bill you for the demolition, plus a $10,000 non-compliance fine. The words, spoken by HOA President Karen Miller, hung in the stale air of the community clubhouse meeting room like a toxic fog. Her voice, a smug, self-satisfied purr, was amplified by the cheap microphone, each syllable a tiny hammer blow against my composure. She sat at the head of a folding table, a plus-size queen on a plastic throne, flanked by her two board member cronies, who nodded along with the vacant enthusiasm of bobbleheads on a dashboard. The 20 or so other residents in attendance shifted uncomfortably in their seats, a mixture of pity and fear on their faces, none of them willing to meet my gaze. It was public humiliation, orchestrated and delivered with theatrical precision. The fence wasn't just a fence. It was a 4-foot-high, 200-foot-long dry-stack stone wall built by my great-grandfather's own hands in 1922, and it was now being condemned by a woman whose greatest lifetime construction project was probably a 7-layer dip. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it was breathtaking. If you think that's insane, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I want to hear your HOA horror stories because I guarantee mine will make yours look like a walk in the park. Now, let me tell you how this all started. My name is Frank Caldwell, Sergeant Major, retired United States Army Corps of Engineers. For 25 years, my job was to build things that last under the worst conditions imaginable and to solve problems that other people deemed impossible. I'm a man who believes in blueprints, in regulations that make sense, and in the unshakable integrity of a properly marked property line. Patience and paperwork are not my enemies. They are my tools. When I retired, I came home to the one place on earth that had always been my anchor, a 10-acre plot of rolling North Carolina woodland that had been in my family for over a century. It was on this land that I built my final home, a modest but solid house designed to my exact specifications, a place of peace after a lifetime of orchestrated chaos. The property itself was an island of old-world calm, but it had one fatal flaw. Its only access to a paved road ran through a small corner of the Oakwood Preserve subdivision, a sprawling development of beige McMansions that had sprung up in the late 90s. To get an address and utilities, I was legally required to join their homeowners association. I paid the dues, kept my head down, and expected to be left alone. It was a tax, I figured, for tranquility. I had gravely underestimated the enemy. My first mistake was underestimating Karen Miller. I'd seen her type before in bloated civilian contractors and petty bureaucrats lording over supply depots. She was a woman who had mistaken her microscopic sliver of authority for genuine power. She drove a golf cart around the neighborhood like a patrol vehicle, a clipboard of violations her only weapon, her face permanently fixed in a mask of sour disapproval. She had waged war on unapproved mailbox flags, on basketball hoops left out overnight, on trash cans put out 2 hours too early. She was a tyrant of the trivial, and I, with my historical, non-conforming, and utterly beautiful stone fence, was an affront to her beige-tinted world order. The fence bordered the road, the very road that fell under the HOA's purview. It was the only part of my 10 acres they could legally touch, and she was determined to make her mark. I had received the first notice a month prior, a sterile form letter citing the covenant. I responded with a polite, registered letter of my own, explaining the historical nature of the wall and including a copy of a photograph from 1935 showing my grandfather standing proudly beside it. I assumed logic and history would prevail. Instead, it was like throwing gasoline on a fire. My appeal was her platform, her chance to prove that no one, not even a decorated veteran with a century-old claim, was above her rules. And that led me to that humiliating meeting, with her 30-day ultimatum echoing in my ears and the weight of a $10,000 fine hanging over my head. I walked out of that clubhouse without saying a word, my face a mask of military calm. But inside, a switch had been flipped. The engineer in me was suppressed, and the strategist took over. Karen Miller had just declared war on the wrong soldier. She wanted a fight about a fence. She had no idea I was about to change the entire battlefield. The days following the HOA meeting were a study in controlled fury. My wife Sarah saw the storm brewing behind my eyes and knew better than to tell me to calm down. Instead, she just kept my coffee mug full and asked, "What's the plan, Frank?" That was why I married her. She knew me. The plan, as always, started with reconnaissance. Emotion was a liability in a conflict like this. Data was ammunition. I declared a temporary truce with the yard work and converted our dining room table into a command center. I drove down to the Forsyth County Records Office, a place that smelled of old paper, dust, and forgotten legal battles. For 2 straight I became a fixture in their archives, a ghost haunting the aisles of massive leather-bound deed books and cabinets filled with microfilm. I pulled every document related to my family's land, starting with the original deed from 1919. I traced the lineage of ownership, the tax records, the easements. Then I pulled the records for the Oakwood Preserve development. I wanted to know everything about my enemy, when they incorporated, who the developer was, and most importantly, the exact legally recorded plat maps that define their territory and, by extension, the limits of Karen's pathetic kingdom. I fed spool after spool of microfilm into the humming reader, the ghostly black and white images of surveyor's notes and legal descriptions flashing before my eyes. It was tedious, painstaking work, the kind of detail-oriented drudgery that would make most people give up. For me, it was familiar terrain. Planning a combat engineering project in a hostile zone requires this same level of obsessive detail. You have to know the ground better than your enemy. I found what I was looking for on the third day. It was the master plat for Oakwood Preserve, filed in 1998. It showed all the lots, the common areas, the roads, and it showed the boundary line it shared with my property. Using the county's light table, I overlaid a copy of my family's original 1920s survey map with the new subdivision plat. They didn't quite match. There was a discrepancy, a slight shift along the northern edge of my property. The developer's survey seemed to claim about 20 feet more than my older map showed. At the time, I chalked it up to the inaccuracies of old-world surveying versus modern techniques. Maybe a change in magnetic north, or a simple error made 80 years ago. It was a curiosity, but my focus remained singular. The fence, I was looking for a loophole, a grandfather clause, an easement, anything that would legally protect that wall of stone. Karen's entire argument, as articulated by her slick lawyer on the phone, hinged on the idea that my new house construction had activated the full force of the covenants over my entire property, nullifying any prior protections. It was a legally shaky assertion, but designed to intimidate. They were counting on me being a typical homeowner who would be scared off by legal jargon and the threat of mounting fees. They didn't know they were dealing with a man who had read and interpreted military construction contracts thicker than a phone book. I found a clause in the HOA's own founding charter that stated its authority was strictly limited to properties and structures for which building permits were issued after the date of this charter's falling. My fence, having been built 76 years before the charter existed, had never had a building permit. It was a pre-existing non-conforming structure in the truest sense. This was my angle. This was the argument I would build my defense on. The small discrepancy in the property line map was filed away in the back of my mind as an insignificant detail. It was a mistake that would nearly cost me everything, but would ultimately give me the weapon I needed to burn Karen's little empire to the ground. Armed with a freshly printed binder, professionally tabbed and organized with military precision, I prepared for the next HOA board meeting. This wasn't going to be an emotional appeal. This was going to be a presentation of facts, a logical dismantling of their flimsy case. I had copies of the original deeds, the historical photos, and the relevant page of their own charter, highlighted in yellow. I was calm, collected, and ready. The meeting was less attended this time. The novelty of my public shaming had worn off. Karen sat at her usual spot, a smug smirk plastered on her face as if she had already won. Before the board moves to authorize the demolition contract, I walked to the front of the room and placed a copy of my binder in front of each board member. "I do," I said, my voice even and clear. "I'd like to direct your attention to Article 4, Section 2 of the HOA's own founding charter, which I've tabbed for your convenience." I laid out my case piece by piece. The fence was built in 1922. The HOA was established in 1998. No permit was ever issued or required for the fence. Therefore, according to their own rules, they had no jurisdiction over it. It was a simple, airtight argument based on their own governing documents. For a moment, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in the eyes of the two bobbleheads. But Karen was prepared. Anticipated, you might try to find such anticipated. You might try to find such a loophole. She tapped a button on a speakerphone placed in the middle of the table. "Mr. Davies, are you there?" A smooth, oily voice filled the room. "I am, Karen. Good evening, board members." It was the HOA's lawyer. "Mr. Caldwell," the voice oozed, "while your historical point is noted, you are failing to account for the precedent of re-engagement. When you undertook new construction on your property, a project of significant scale, you effectively re-engage the entirety of your parcel with the current community standards. Your new home cannot exist in a vacuum. It integrates your property into the community, and therefore all structures on said property become subject to the community's covenants." It was complete and utter nonsense. A legal argument woven from thin air and designed to sound impressive and intimidating. It was a scare tactic, pure and simple. But to the board members and the few residents present, it sounded official. It sounded like law. Karen's smirk returned, wider than ever. "The board appreciates your presentation, Mr. Caldwell," she said, barely containing her glee. "But in light of counsel's advice, the original ruling stands. The 30-day clock," she paused for dramatic effect, "is still ticking. You now have 23 days. I gathered my papers, my face an unreadable mask. I had lost the battle, but the war was far from over. As I left, a few people stopped me in the hallway, their voices low and conspiratorial. "Mr. Henderson, an elderly man who had lived in Oakwood since it was built, shook his head. "She's a menace, son. Fined me $200 last month because my garden gnome was, and I quote, displaying a whimsical attitude inconsistent with the neighborhood's aesthetic." A young couple, the Garcias, told me about their ordeal trying to get a backyard swing set approved for their kids, a process that took 6 months and 3 different color swatches for the plastic slide. I realized then that my fight wasn't just about my fence. It was about a pattern of abuse, a systemic misuse of power. I took out a small notebook from my pocket and started taking notes. Every fine, every threat, every ridiculous rule. Karen thought she was just fighting an old soldier over a pile of rocks. She didn't realize she was creating an insurgency. The lawyer's nonsensical re-engagement theory, while infuriating, gave me clarity. This was no longer a matter of interpretation or historical precedent. Karen and her legal puppet master were simply making up rules as they went, confident that no one would have the resources or the will to challenge them in court. Arguing with them was pointless. It was like trying to reason with a brick wall, except this brick wall could fine you $10,000. I needed a different kind of weapon. Not a legal argument, but an undeniable physical fact. I needed to prove, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the fence was entirely outside their jurisdiction. And for that, I needed a survey. Not just any survey, but a modern, state-of-the-art boundary survey using GPS technology, accurate to within a fraction of an inch. I wanted something that would be irrefutable in a court of law, a document that would establish my property lines so definitively that even their slick lawyer couldn't twist the meaning. I found a highly rated firm out of Charlotte and explained the situation. I didn't just want them to mark the lines from the old deed. I specifically requested that they locate the original 1920s survey pins my great-grandfather had installed. I knew from family lore that they were solid iron rods, driven deep into the earth at each corner of the property. Finding them would be the key to validating the historical accuracy of my claim. It was an expensive proposition, a significant investment in a fight I might still lose, but I considered it ammunition, and you can't put a price on having the right ammunition. The survey crew arrived a week later. There were 3 of them. 2 young tech-savvy guys who operated the GPS rover and the total station, and an older grizzled surveyor named Gus, who looked like he'd been walking property lines since the invention of the compass. I showed Gus the old hand-drawn map from the county records, and his eyes lit up. He had a passion for the historical side of his work, what he called forensic surveying. He loved the challenge of reconciling old maps with new technology. They spent the first day working the southern and western boundaries of my 10 acres, easily finding the old iron pins with a sophisticated metal detector. Everything was matching up perfectly with the historical record. On the second day, they moved to the contentious northern and eastern lines, the ones that bordered the Oakwood Preserve subdivision. I watched from my porch as they worked their way along the edge of the woods, their fluorescent vests bright against the green foliage. Around noon, I saw Gus leave the others and walk out into the open, manicured space of the HOA common area. He moved slowly, deliberately, sweeping the metal detector back and forth over the pristine lawn that surrounded the community clubhouse. He was heading for the putting green, a patch of unnaturally perfect grass right next to the pool deck. Reached into the hole and pulled his hand back out, his face a mixture of confusion and awe. He motioned for me to come over. As I walked across the lawn, my heart began to pound. Something was wrong. Or maybe, for the first time, something was finally right. I reached Gus, who was still kneeling by the small hole in the ground, not 10 feet from the corner of the clubhouse building. He didn't say a word. He just pointed into the hole. There, nestled in the dark earth, was the rusted, unmistakable top of a 1-inch thick iron rod, the northeast corner pin of my family's property. Gus looked up at me, his face pale. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I've shot this with the GPS. I've checked it against the old plat in the county monuments. There is no doubt. This is your property corner." He stood up, took a deep breath, and pointed a trembling finger at the sprawling, 2-story clubhouse. According to this, and I've triple-checked the data, about a third of their clubhouse, including the manager's office and the restrooms, the entire deep end of their swimming pool, the pump house, and both of their tennis courts, they're on your land. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air rushed out of my lungs. The fight was never about the fence. The fence was a symptom. The real issue, the one that had been hiding in plain sight for 20 years, was a colossal multi-million-dollar error. The discrepancy on the maps wasn't a surveyor's mistake from the 1920s. It was a land grab, either intentional or through gross negligence, by the developer in 1998. Karen Miller, in her obsessive quest to tear down my great-grandfather's stone wall, had inadvertently handed me a nuclear bomb, and she had no idea I was about to light the fuse. The drive home from the property line was surreal. The anger I had been nursing for weeks evaporated, replaced by a feeling of cold, crystalline clarity. This was no longer a petty squabble with a neighborhood tyrant. This was an operation. The fence, the $10,000 fine, the public humiliation, they were no longer the objectives. They were now the bait in a much larger trap. My first call was not to a lawyer, but to my oldest friend, Dave Jensen. We had served together for 15 years before he retired as a colonel, got his law degree, and became a partner at a top firm specializing in exactly this kind of high-stakes property and contract law. I laid out the situation for him on a conference call, emailing him the newly completed survey, the historical maps, and the file I had compiled on Karen's pattern of abuse against other residents. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then a low whistle. "Frank," Dave said, his voice a mix of shock and professional excitement, "this isn't a lawsuit. This is a tactical nuclear strike. You don't just have them on encroachment. You have them on continuing a trespass in unjust enrichment. This is beautiful." He explained the legal landscape. The HOA might try to claim adverse possession, arguing they'd been using the land openly for over 20 years. But Dave was quick to point out the fatal flaws in that argument. They hadn't been paying property taxes on my 1.2 acres, a key requirement for an adverse possession claim in North Carolina. Furthermore, their possession was based on a faulty, likely fraudulent survey. Their claim was built on a foundation of sand. Together, we mapped out a three-phase plan of attack, just like we used to plan engineering missions in the field. Phase 1 was to fortify our position. The very next morning, Dave's firm filed the new GPS-certified survey with the County Registrar of Deeds. This was a critical, preemptive strike. It officially and publicly recorded my true property lines, making them a matter of legal fact before the HOA even knew what was happening. We now had a government-stamped document that proved our claim. Phase 2 was the rope-a-dope strategy. We would do nothing. We would not respond to the HOA's letters. We would not mention the survey or the clubhouse. We would let Karen's 30-day deadline for the fence demolition expire. We needed her to make the next move. We needed her to overplay her hand and commit an act of aggression. We were baiting the trap. Phase 3 would be the counteroffensive, to be launched the moment her demolition crew arrived. While we waited, I began my own quiet preparations. I contacted a local heavy equipment rental company and asked for a quote to install a 6-foot-high chain-link fence with privacy slats and barbed wire top along a specific 800-foot section of my property. I made sure they understood it was a rush job that might need to be done on a moment's notice. I continued my conversations with my neighbors, the insurgency as I had started to call them. I gathered signed affidavits from Mr. Henderson, the Garcias, and a dozen others, each one detailing Karen's abuse of power, the arbitrary fines, and the constant harassment. These documents might not be directly relevant to the property line dispute, but they would be invaluable in painting a picture of a rogue board president engaged in a personal vendetta. This was no longer just about my land, it was about liberating an entire community. The clock was ticking down to Karen's deadline, but for the first time, I felt completely in control. Crisp and clear. I was awake before the crisp and clear. I was awake before the sun, sitting on my porch with a mug of black coffee, waiting. The quiet of the morning was broken at precisely 7:30 a.m. by the guttural roar of diesel engines and the rhythmic beeping of heavy machinery in reverse. A flatbed truck carrying a large yellow bulldozer, followed by a lowboy with a massive excavator, rumbled down the street and parked directly in front of my property. The demolition crew had arrived, and right behind them in her obnoxious, souped-up golf cart with HOA president, stenciled on the side, was Karen Miller. She was wearing a hot pink velour tracksuit and holding a clipboard, looking for all the world like a portly suburban dictator about to oversee an execution. Her two bobblehead board members were with her, their faces alight with smug anticipation. A small crowd of neighbors, drawn by the commotion, gathered on their lawns, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and dread. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the public culmination of her power. She was going to make an example of me. I took a final sip of my coffee, stood up, and walked calmly down my driveway to meet them. The foreman of the demolition crew, a burly man with a sunburnt neck and a weary expression, was unhooking the chains from the bulldozer. "Morning, I said, my voice steady. "That's a nice-looking piece of equipment you've got there. A Caterpillar D6, isn't it?" Before he could answer, Karen zipped over in her golf cart, braking with a dramatic squeal. "Mr. Caldwell, I see you've decided not to comply with the board's directive," she announced, her voice loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. "As stated in our legally binding notice, the full cost of this demolition, estimated at $12,000, plus your $10,000 fine, will be levied against your property." She was positively glowing with victory. I ignored her completely and focused on the foreman. I held out a thick 9x12 envelope. "This is for you and for your employer," I said. "Inside, you will find a cease and desist letter from my attorney, a copy of a court-filed injunction preventing any action against the structure you're about to demolish, and a notice of criminal trespass that will be served the moment any piece of your equipment touches my property." The foreman paused, his hand hovering over a chain binder. He looked at me, then at Karen, his expression souring. He took the envelope. I continued, "You will also find a copy of a new boundary survey, officially recorded with the Forsyth County Clerk of Courts last week. My lawyer's business card is clipped to the front. I'd advise you to call him before you start your engines." The man's face went from weary to worried. He tore open the envelope and his eyes scanned the first page, the bold letters of the injunction jumping out at him. "Lady," he said, turning to Karen and shaking his head, "I can't touch this. This is a court order. My boss would have my hide." Karen's face, which had been a triumphant pink, began to shift to a blotchy, furious purple. "What is this nonsense? You were hired by the Oakwood Preserve HOA. I am the president. You will do as you're told." She snatched the papers from his hand, her eyes blazing with rage. She scanned the documents, her brain struggling to process the legal terminology. Injunction, trespass, cease and desist. Her voice trailed off as her eyes fell upon the folded survey map. She unfolded it, her breath caught in her throat. She saw the bold red line that marked my property. She saw how it sliced cleanly through the drawing of the HOA clubhouse, annexing the pool and the tennis courts. The clipboard fell from her hand, scattering papers across the asphalt. The war was over, and she had just realized she had been fighting on the wrong side of the border all along. The silence that fell over the street was deafening. The gathered neighbors, who had been expecting the thunderous crash of a century-old wall coming down, were instead treated to the quiet spectacle of Karen Miller's entire world collapsing. They began to murmur amongst themselves, sensing the seismic shift in power. "This is fake," Karen finally sputtered, her voice a shrill, desperate shriek. She waved the survey map in the air, as if trying to shake the offending lines off the page. "This is a trick, a forgery." "It's no trick, Karen," I said, my voice calm but carrying with the authority of a parade ground command. "It's a state-certified GPS-plotted survey, filed and recorded as public record. While you were obsessing over my great-grandfather's fence, you seem to have missed a slightly more significant violation of property rights. For the last 22 years, the Oakwood Preserve Homeowners Association has been illegally occupying approximately 1.2 acres of my private land." I turned my attention from her and addressed the crowd of my neighbors, my voice rising so they could all hear. "The land that your expensive clubhouse sits on," I said, pointing a finger directly at the building, "the pool your children swim in, the tennis courts you play on, it all belongs to me. It has always belonged to my family." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. "Mr." Henderson's jaw literally dropped. The Garcias clutched each other's arms in disbelief. The foundation of their community, both literally and figuratively, had just been obliterated. Karen looked wildly around, seeking support, but found only stunned, accusing faces. "Lies! The developer built that! We have the deeds! We have our own survey!" she yelled, her voice cracking. At that precise moment, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and out stepped my friend, Dave Jensen, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Karen's golf cart. He looked like he had been sent from central casting for the role of unstoppable lawyer. "You have a deed based on a faulty and likely fraudulent survey from 1998, Ms. Miller," Dave said, his voice cutting through the air like a razor. "My client, Mr. Caldwell, holds the senior title, a clear and unbroken chain of ownership dating back to 1922. We have the original physical survey markers in the ground, we have the county's historical records, and we have a court-certified survey that validates our claim beyond any doubt." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before delivering the final devastating blow. "Frankly, every dollar in HOA dues you've collected and spent to maintain and improve that clubhouse and those amenities has been an investment in my client's private property. On his behalf, we thank you for your diligent upkeep." The irony was so thick, it was almost suffocating. The demolition foreman, who had been watching this all unfold with a look of growing horror, finally understood he was in the middle of a legal minefield. He gestured to his driver, started the engine of the bulldozer, and began the slow, loud process of reloading it onto the flatbed. The sound of the diesel engine was the death knell of Karen's authority. She was left standing alone in the middle of the street, her pink tracksuit suddenly looking pathetic, holding the very piece of paper that proved she wasn't just a petty tyrant, but the unwitting steward of the single greatest covenant violation in the history of Oakwood Preserve. The news of the clubhouse's true ownership spread through the neighborhood faster than a gossip column. My phone began ringing off the hook. People I'd only ever nodded to were stopping their cars in the street to give me a thumbs up. The narrative had flipped completely. I was no longer the stubborn rule-breaker. I was the wronged landowner. The David who had just revealed Goliath was standing on his vegetable garden. The HOA board, in a state of sheer panic, called an emergency meeting for that evening. But this time it wasn't a sparsely attended affair in a stuffy room. The entire community turned out. They packed the clubhouse, my clubhouse, to the rafters. People were standing along the walls, spilling out into the hallway, their faces a mixture of anger, fear, and morbid curiosity. Karen and her two remaining board members sat at the head table, looking small and overwhelmed. The atmosphere was electric with hostility. She tried to call the meeting to order, but her voice was drowned out by a chorus of shouted questions. How could the board not know this? Are our dues going to pay for the lawsuit of the century? You spent thousands trying to tear down a legal fence while our entire clubhouse is illegal? What does this do to our property values? Dave and I attended, arriving a few minutes late to ensure maximum impact. We didn't say a word. We simply walked to the front row of seats, which parted for us like the Red Sea, and sat down. Our silence was a weapon, a tangible presence in the room that was more powerful than any shouted accusation. The HOA's lawyer, Mr. Davies, appeared on a large video screen, having wisely chosen not to appear in person. He looked frazzled, his usual slick demeanor replaced by a sheen of nervous sweat. He tried to calm the crowd with legal platitudes about title insurance claims and negotiated easements, but the residents weren't buying it. They could smell the disaster. The moment of truth came when Mr. Henderson, his voice trembling with righteous anger, stood up and asked, Mr. Davies, on a scale of 1 to 10, how screwed are we? Davies stammered, trying to deflect, but the crowd roared for an answer. Finally, he sighed and admitted, our preliminary review of Mr. Caldwell's claim and the supporting documentation indicates that his position is substantially credible. A wave of groans and curses swept through the room. Substantially credible was lawyer speak for we are completely and utterly screwed. Karen then made her final fatal error. Instead of showing contrition, she went on the attack. She tried to blame the developer who had declared bankruptcy 15 years ago. She blamed the county for accepting the faulty plat. She blamed the title insurance company. She blamed everyone and everything except her own obsessive, vindictive crusade that had brought this catastrophe to light. But the residents saw right through it. They understood that this disaster could have remained a dormant, harmless secret for another 20 years, if not for her personal vendetta against me and my fence. Her lust for power had not only been her own undoing, but had now placed a financial sword of Damocles over every single homeowner in the subdivision. The two board members sitting beside her began to subtly slide their chairs away from her, a physical act of disassociation. Her reign was over. The only question left was how unconditional her surrender would be. A week passed, a week filled with frantic calls between lawyers and the terrified members of the HOA's insurance company. The community was in an uproar. A petition for a vote of no confidence in Karen Miller circulated, gaining the required number of signatures in less than a day. An emergency election was held, and a new interim board was formed, headed by none other than the gnome-loving Mr. Henderson. His first official act was to request a meeting with me. They came to my house, not as adversaries, but as supplicants. Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Garcia, and another longtime resident sat at my dining room table, the same table that had served as my war room just weeks before. The air was thick with tension. Dave was there with me, a silent partner, his presence a clear signal that this was a formal negotiation, not a friendly chat. Mr. Henderson, looking deeply uncomfortable in his new role, cleared his throat. Frank, he began, first on behalf of the community, I want to apologize for the way you've been treated. It was wrong. There's no other word for it. He paused, then looked me in the eye. We've seen your lawyer's preliminary demands. We know we have no leverage here. So we're here to ask, what do you want? What will it take to make this right? I let the question hang in the air for a long moment, then gave Dave a slight nod. My terms are not complicated, I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion, and they are non-negotiable. Dave slid a thin, leather-bound folder across the polished surface of the table. Mr. Henderson opened it, his hands trembling slightly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, outlining my 5 conditions for surrender. First, the land. The HOA would purchase the 1.2 acres of encroached land from me. The price would be based on the current fair market value for fully developed commercial-grade property, a figure calculated by a professional appraiser and amounting to a sum that would guarantee my grandchildren would not have to worry about college tuition. There would be no haggling. Second, the fence. My great-grandfather's stone wall would be officially designated a community historical landmark in the new HOA bylaws, protecting it from any future boards or presidents in perpetuity. Furthermore, the HOA would immediately contract and pay for a full, professional restoration of the wall by artisan stonemasons. Third, governance reform. The HOA's labyrinthine book of covenants would be torn up and rewritten from scratch. All subjective aesthetic rules, paint colors, lawn ornaments, mailbox flags, basketball hoops would be permanently abolished. The board's power would be strictly curtailed to the essential functions of maintaining the actual common areas and infrastructure, with all financial decisions handled by a transparent, third-party management company. Fourth, atonement. Karen Miller would be required to deliver a formal, public letter of apology to be read aloud at the next community meeting and mailed to every single homeowner. The apology would be addressed not only to me, but to every family she had wrongly fined or harassed during her tenure. All such fines levied under her presidency were to be refunded in full with interest from the HOA's reserve funds. And the fifth and final condition, Karen Miller was to resign immediately from the board and would be permanently barred from ever holding any position of authority, elected or volunteer, within the Oakwood Preserve HOA for as long as she lived there. It was total, unconditional surrender. Mr. Henderson and the others read the terms, their faces a mixture of shock at the audacity and relief that it wasn't worse. They knew, and I knew, that I could have demanded the demolition of the clubhouse. I could have bankrupted them all. This was not destruction, it was reformation. After a few moments of whispered consultation, Mr. Henderson looked up, his eyes meeting mine. "We agree," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. "We agree to all of it." The final HOA meeting was less a meeting and more a formal treaty signing ceremony. It was held in the clubhouse on my former land, which lent the proceedings a surreal historical gravity. The room was packed again, but this time the anger was gone, replaced by a sense of weary relief and anticipation for a new beginning. Mr. Henderson presided, and with a solemn efficiency, the new streamlined bylaws were ratified by a unanimous vote. The land sale contract was approved, and the treasurer of the interim board, a CPA who had been one of Karen's most frequent targets, slid a certified check across the table to Dave. The amount was staggering, a life-altering sum that represented 22 years of back rent, interest, and punitive damages all rolled into one. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. Mr. Henderson called Karen Miller to the front. She looked like a ghost. The garish pink tracksuit was gone, replaced by a drab gray pantsuit that seemed to hang off her. Her face was pale and drawn, the smugness completely erased, leaving behind only a hollowed-out shell of bitterness. She stood before the microphone, clutching a single piece of paper in her trembling hands, and began to read her forced apology. Her voice was a monotone, devoid of any genuine emotion, but the words themselves were a litany of her abuses, a public confession of her reign of petty terror. She apologized for the fines, for the harassment, for the vendetta against my fence. She never once looked up from the paper. It was a profoundly humiliating spectacle, a complete and public dismantling of the ego that had caused so much trouble for so many people. When she finished, she placed the paper on the table and walked out of the room without another word, disappearing from the community's public life forever. But the most satisfying moment for me came a few weeks later. It wasn't receiving the check or watching Karen's downfall. It was waking up one morning to the gentle clink, clink, clink of hammers on stone. A team of master stonemasons, the best in the state, were meticulously restoring my great-grandfather's wall. They were cleaning the century-old lichen, resetting the stones that had shifted over time, and ensuring its integrity for another 100 years. The HOA was paying them a premium for their work. The wall, once a symbol of defiance, was now a protected monument, a testament to endurance and a reminder that true value lies in history and integrity, not in manufactured conformity. I took a significant portion of the money from the land farm and, working with Dave, established a community trust fund. It was an endowment managed by the new Sensible HOA board to be used for things that actually enrich the neighborhood. We built a brand new playground for the kids, established a college scholarship fund for graduates of the local high school, and seeded a legal aid reserve for any resident who ever again felt they were being targeted unfairly by those in power. The entire atmosphere of Oakwood Preserve changed. It was like a cloud had lifted. People started talking to each other again. The Garcias painted their front door a brilliant, beautiful, and completely unapproved shade of cobalt blue. Mr. Henderson installed an entire flock of plastic pink flamingos in his front yard, a whimsical act of joyful rebellion. Life, in all its colorful, non-conforming glory, had returned. I often sit on my porch now in the quiet of the evening and look out at that old stone wall, its lines straight and true under the setting sun. It's more than a boundary marker. It's a legacy. It's a quiet monument to the simple truth that you don't mess with a man's land, you don't disrespect his family's history, and you should always, always check the survey map before you declare war on an old soldier who knows how to read one. The real victory wasn't financial. It was the restoration of peace and the quiet, deeply satisfying knowledge that justice delivered with patience and precision is the most powerful weapon of all.